Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. As always, I am so humbled and flattered that you show up each week to hear our stories, learn from our SBC friends and supporters, and hopefully leave with a sense of community that you are not alone. A couple of quick updates. So in addition to our podcast, I would also like to invite you to join our Thursday Night Thrivers meetup. It's a no-agenda meetup where we share our personal experiences with breast cancer, ask questions, and get peer-to-peer support. Open to all stages, caregivers, and allies. All are welcome. We also host an MBC webinar series every other Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern and a monthly book club. You can find out more about all of our upcoming events and webinars at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. I would also absolutely love it if you showed us some love and started following us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at SBC_ORG and on Instagram at survivingbreastcancer.org. We also just started a new handle specifically for the podcast, which is Breast Cancer Conversations. But today I am so excited to be speaking with three amazing women. We have Lisa, Natalia, and Sheila, who are all joining us today. They are joining us on behalf of our MBC Life, which is also another fun podcast that I highly encourage you to check out and to listen to. One of the things I love about my job is being able to bring these amazing and incredible resources to you, our listeners, and to collaborate with other podcast hosts because, yes, #podcast life. So without further ado, let's jump into today's conversation where we're talking about all things MBC.
I think people are more open to hearing about MBC stories and medically speaking or through research, kind of trying to find a way to live with MBC instead of passing it on to early stage people living with early stage breast cancer. But I do think that it's been not easy to have conversation about MBC and bringing it to life. Even before when I was an early stager, you have the assumption that living with metastatic disease kind of feels like you're at the end of your rope. It's almost as if you're past the time to help. Being in a community with other MBC people kind of opens up this idea that there are so many people living with MBC. There are so many people who have lots of stories to share and to tell about thriving and living with MBC.
Welcome to the conversation.
Hi, my name is Sheila McGlown, and I live in Illinois. I'm about 12 miles from the Missouri border, about 4 hours from Chicago. I am a 25-year Air Force veteran, and I found out I had metastatic breast cancer while I was active duty. My mom was diagnosed in 2001. 2004, she died of metastatic breast cancer. That had spread to her lungs, and then I didn't know metastatic meant stage 4. 5 years later, I received the diagnosis and I felt a sneeze, and the sneeze was the cancer rubbing up on my ribs.
Oh, wow.
So I had to retire from the military, and that's when I said that I was going to better understand the disease because I didn't know Black women got breast cancer because Black women don't talk about being sick. We just don't talk about being sick in our culture. And when it happened, I said that I am going to do what I can. I'm going to do what I can that my daughter never, or anybody's daughter's son, never has to worry about this disease. So that's why I advocate for metastatic breast cancer. I think we have strong, resilient advocates out that are passionate, even though they're facing this disease. They put disease behind them, and they want people to know that, they want to help. They want more research. So that's who I am. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned that your mother had breast cancer. Was that something that you were aware of when she was diagnosed? I know we mentioned a lot of times we keep this stuff close to our vest. We don't talk about it. And we also want to be strong for our family and our children. Was that something that you and her spoke about while she was going through her cancer diagnosis?
No, because I was in the military. I was in Okinawa, Japan. September 11th happened. I get the call maybe a day or two. Mom has breast cancer. I'm like, what? Lumpectomy. Well, what's the lumpectomy? Chemo. I thought you get chemo, you fixed.
Right. Right.
But, 3 years later, that spread to her lungs. And I found out, I was talking to my mom. She forgot my birthday. And I was like, my mom never forgets my birthday. August 17th. I went home July 31st because I was in Virginia. August 17th, she passed. Mm. So I don't know whether I blame. I thought you walk the walk, you walk a Coleman walk or whatever. I did my diligence, for breast cancer. But soon did I find out there's more to it than that. So
they make it look easy with the pink boas and all these women taking over the streets and walking. I am completely there with you. Lisa, tell us a little bit about your story. I understand that you also had some family history with breast cancer as well.
Yeah, my first introduction to breast cancer was when I was 12, and my grandmother, who I was very close to, decided to show me the top of her scars. And so she had a pretty radical mastectomy in 1971 and was told she had 6 months to live. Literally, she went in for a mole removal and came out without a breast. So that's just the crazy 1970 medical story for you. And she was amazing. She was able to live until she was 95 and die of congestive heart failure, basically of old age instead of breast cancer. My whole family, I'm indeed the fourth generation of my family to have breast cancer, but I'm the first in my family to be diagnosed de novo metastatic. So because of my family history, I had mammograms and ultrasounds actually from the age of 35 and was considered high risk, certainly, but all of my family prior to me they were diagnosed with breast cancer, all early stage breast cancer, and very similar to what Sheila said. Or what you said, actually, Laura, that you do the chemo, maybe have the mastectomy, have a lumpectomy, and you're good to go, and you'll die of old age. And certainly that is the case with my mother, my two aunts who are still living with being early stage breast cancer. They're doing fine. So everyone in my family was quite shocked with my diagnosis. Part of my story is that it was clearly missed. I kept on going back to my OBGYN twice, actually, in both 2016 and 2017, saying my breast tissue does not feel normal. There was no lump. And I had mammograms and ultrasounds every time, and they kept on coming back. You're fine. And then finally, in August 2017, my nipple inverted on my right breast. And that was I clearly said, well, I know that's breast cancer. So let's go back again. We did a biopsy at that point, and so they determined it was breast cancer. And then the MRI, as I was preparing for surgery, was required. And that's what discovered the Mets on my spine. And I was diagnosed in August 2017 with oligometastatic breast cancer, de novo oligometastatic breast cancer. So I only had two to three spots on my spine at diagnosis. And certainly that was a shock, and shock for my family, because we've been down this breast cancer road for a long time, but it was always early stage. And again, dismissed as something you could manage. Certainly everyone in my family has been able to manage it. And so for me, that was the beginning of my true education of what breast cancer really was all about.
Lisa, I want to take a moment to define some of the terms that you were mentioning. So first being the metastatic de novo, being diagnosed de novo. And what that means is that you're diagnosed automatically with metastasis. That is to say that the breast cancer has spread beyond just the breast and into other regions of the body, whether it's in the bones, the liver, the lungs, the brain, etc. And so what this means for patients who are diagnosed metastatic de novo, it means that they were never diagnosed with an earlier stage cancer. They were automatically diagnosed metastatic, stage 4. The other term that you mentioned is oligometastatic breast cancer. Oligo in this sense means few. And so oligometastatic breast cancer would mean that there are few mets within the body in these other external places, whether it's the lungs, the spine, the bones, the liver, etc. And so, I don't have an exact definition of what few means, anywhere between 3 and 7, possibly 10. But the idea is that it is not widespread and that there are few mets outside of the breast. So that's where we get the term oligometastatic breast cancer. So Lisa, can you explain to us then why this type of diagnosis is important?
Now, the reason why that's even important is that there are studies about on individuals who are considered oligometastatic, that perhaps there's different treatments or ways to approach it, and perhaps your outcomes may be extended. But
Sure.
I also know people who've been oligometastatic, and that's, an extended time frame is not necessarily true. As you said, we don't know quite why we have unicorns. We need to find out why, exactly. and then replicate that.
Exactly. And, I think even within this umbrella, this huge umbrella of breast cancer, now that we're in it, there are so many subcategories, so many subsets of who and how we're identifying with, and the tribes that we're trying to form, because we want to be supported by people who are going through similar experiences. And so I think when we're talking about de novo metastatic, that in and of itself is an own class, because you're being proactive, as you were mentioning, Lisa, doing these high risk screenings and even advocating for yourself, saying that, something doesn't feel right, but it is so hard, with some of the technology that we have with the mammograms and the ultrasounds. And, a lot of times, yes, it is a lump, but then you also have the lobular and other types of characteristics that aren't necessarily showing up on the technology that we're using to screen. So it's very complex. And so, I appreciate you sharing these stories and giving voice to this, you and Sheila both, to this subset of, being diagnosed immediately at a metastasis level.
Yeah. And if I want to add, Laura, I think it's really important to say that it was discovered that I actually have mixed ductal and lobular characteristics to my breast cancer. And it was discovered a year and a half after I was initially diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. So the initial biopsy of my tumor did not reveal at that moment that I was a mixed ductal and lobular case. And why that's interesting is that lobular, of course, is very hard to detect often, because the cells grow in sheets and not in lumps necessarily. And also our friends who have inflammatory breast cancer have the same situation, where sometimes a lump does not form. And then the other piece that's important to note is that if you have dense breast tissue, I tell everybody who will listen to me that if you have dense breast tissue, just please demand an MRI. Yes. Because for me, I was told from very early, you have very dense breast tissue and we really can't see anything. So in my case, probably there's 7 years of really useless microfilm, ultrasound and, mammography that just really isn't worth the screen it's printed on, because it wasn't going to be detected unless you had an MRI.
Yes. And
so
that
I just
is
want to make sure.
A huge soapbox of mine too, talking about the dense breast tissue, and that your results on your mammogram are only as good as your density, right? And you get these letters in the mail. Not every state even gives you one of those letters to notify you that you have dense tissue. But then, when you read down in the small print, it was like, oh, all clear based on this particular type of screening. So really, do we know? So I'm with you there, letting everyone know about that and what that means. Now, Natalia, your story is a little bit different than Lisa and Sheila's. So whereas they were diagnosed metastatic de novo, you were actually diagnosed early stage and had a recurrence. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with breast cancer?
Sure. So I was diagnosed 3 months after my son was born. So that was in 2017. Yes, that sounds right. So Yes, 2017. And I was breastfeeding at the time, and I just noticed a lump. I thought that it had to be a blood duct from breastfeeding. So I did everything that everyone tells you to do to release your ducts, which is like taking warm showers, squeezing them out, make sure you're over breastfeeding, pump, and nothing was going away. So I called my sister, and she just like, get into the doctors, because if you have mastitis, like it hurts, and you'll need to be put on antibiotics and get in them before it gets worse. So luckily, the person I saw is the first time I ever saw this OB, because my OB had just moved out of state. And she was just like, you don't have any of the symptoms for mastitis. So let's just take a look inside and see what's going on. It's probably a blocked duct or something growing, but we shouldn't be too worried. And then it just kind of escalated from there. So I was diagnosed with early stage, about 2B, maybe something more, but they just weren't sure based off of the size of the tumors and how many lymph nodes were affected. So
I'm smiling because that sounds like my story too.
Yeah. So I never know what to say. I just say what my original diagnosis was, but it could have been a later stage, not 4, but stage 3. Anyway, so you go through your year of being on active treatment. So going through chemotherapy and doing the radiation and having the surgeries. And I stopped active treatment in November of 2018. And by January of 2019, I started feeling symptomatic, primarily on my back. So they just did x-rays and a CT without contrast, and they weren't able to find anything. But I thought, I had cancer, so I need to take care of my body now and really think about what to do. So I started seeing other specialists and other doctors for my back. So going through physical therapy, seeing my family practitioner, who then referred me to a spine specialist. And, seeing a specialist, you have to schedule months in advance, unless it's an emergency. So I was just seeing a physical therapist up until I saw the spine specialist, and she ordered CT with contrast. And they had discovered that the breast cancer had metastasized on my spine and several other places, like on my hip. I had a small little one on my rib. So that was in 2019. So since then, I've been through probably 3 different treatments and have had radiation maybe 3 or 4 times in different parts of my body. And then just last winter in November, I had found out that my cancer had metastasized to my brain. So that was just treating that. And then now, so far things are so good. Treatment seems to be working. But yeah, it kind of all just snowballed, really.
Yeah.
It just went from I wish there was a little bit of time before I had progression. I know that sounds weird to say, but it's just from one thing to another. You hear about people progressing maybe years and years after their original diagnosis, but it just kind of went
I feel it's always year 4 right before they get the benchmark of year 5, or year 9 right before they hit milestone 10 or something like that. So,
and I always feel people get diagnosed at it's never a good time to be diagnosed, but it always feels it's right before the holidays or right before a significant birthday or anniversary. You hear stories and everyone talks about just so. Mine isn't any different really than those people's stories, but yeah. So,
and what were some of the symptoms, and how did you know that it metastasized to your brain? Was that just through a routine MRI or scan every 3 months that people typically get? Or was there?
Well, you got to love insurance, right? Because they don't want to pay for anything that they don't need to pay for. So I have a really great team at my oncologist's office, and it's just basically if you have any symptoms, let us know what it is. And one of the symptoms was under my chin was starting to get really numb. And I just didn't have feeling there. And it could be a plethora of other things. But my nurse practitioner, who I love very much, she was just you know what, let's just do a brain MRI. She's numbness is a sign that something can be there. And she's we know you're stage 4. And unfortunately, my subtypes to FIR were ER positive and HER2 positive when I was originally diagnosed. However, that HER2 was just like barely a HER2. They had to do more sensitive testing to make sure I fell into that category. And when they had biopsied my bones, there wasn't a HER2 positive. So just ER positive. Anyways, I started feeling numbness on my face, and then some like numbness on one side of my body, on my right hand. Mm-hmm. And then it started to kind of, I guess, like twitch. And there was some speculation that it could have been a reaction to one certain drug I was taking and some steroids I was on. So they finally did the MRI, and that's when they discovered some tumor and some plaque in my brain.
Yeah. Natalia, thank you so much for sharing that story and informing our listeners about recurrence, and not just recurring in one spot, but also metastasizing from your spine onto your brain. I know we always have questions about this, so I really appreciate you sharing the signs and the symptoms. And as always, and everything, we wish you all of the best. And, treatments and cures cannot come fast enough. Can you all share a little bit about how breast cancer has impacted your relationship with friends and family?
Okay. Well, I have a story of when I was first diagnosed. So when it was a shock, as I described earlier, and I'm hormone positive. So Natalia, thank you for reminding me to explain. I'm hormone positive and HER2 negative. So for me, it was a shock, and it took me 4 days to tell my husband. I couldn't tell him, and he was with me when I was getting all of these tests done. And then I remember changing from my MRI, and my doctor at the time, my oncologist at the time, asked for a rapid read of the MRI, because I guess she suspected. And so she told me while I was changing as I was getting out of the MRI, and it took me 4 days from that changing room to actually say the words to my husband. So that pretty much sums up my early days in learning to live with this disease. I have quickly gone over to the other side, in that I also agree with you, Laura, that talking about the scary is what brings the light into the room, and doesn't diminish how scary it is or how terrible or hard it can be. But by talking about it, and by being proactive about finding resources for others, helping my family members in making sure that all of them, and yes, they all get MRIs at this point, and my family actually resides in Canada. And so getting MRIs is actually a little bit more challenging. I guess you could argue that. And so all of them instantly got MRIs as a result of my diagnosis. And so that's how I've managed it. We talk about it, and I decide to live in metastatic breast cancer land fully and openly. Mm-hmm. And that's just how I've decided to live.
Lisa, and what was going on in your mind during these 4 days? Were you processing? What were you thinking?
Yeah, it was a lot of mental jujitsu. It was me preparing myself to devastate another life, not just my own, and the ripple effect of this diagnosis on my family. And so with our children who were in high school and in college at the time, the choice was made. Once I told my husband, there was a choice in telling them I have breast cancer. But as I told you earlier, breast cancer in our family is kind of, it's like today's Friday.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mom has breast cancer. We expected it to happen a little earlier than we thought, because I was supposed to get it when I was about 63. That's pretty much on target with the rest of my family.
Yeah.
Post menopause, breast cancer's coming down the pike. And so I was pre-menopause. And so that was a little bit of a surprise, but no big deal. Nana lived till she was 95. This is going to be fine. But we chose not to tell them the full extent of my disease until after my youngest child had gotten all of his college applications out. We just decided, let's just keep things as simple as possible. I'm deciding or figuring out how I'm doing on this current treatment. Yep. And then we were able to tell them when a few months after my initial diagnosis. That's how I decided to handle it with my children initially.
That's so helpful. And to be able to communicate with your children with age-appropriate information, really just assessing everything that's happening in their lives and being able to find an opportune time to deliver this news that, as you mentioned, will be life-altering. Sheila, can we turn to you?
I think initially, I've been living with it for 11 years.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. It was hard. Because it was the same disease that killed my mom. Mm-hmm. That stole her from me. And I didn't have time to process it because I had to be there for everybody else. So I can't break down, because if I break down, everybody else is going to break down. And to tell my dad, he could potentially lose one of his daughters to breast cancer, like he lost his wife, I never had time to process it. You go from being 25 years in the military to, you got stage 4 breast cancer that's in your ribs and liver, to, now you have to retire. Now you have to be on treatment the rest of your life, Then, I only have one daughter, and, I told her, she talking about, I'm gonna have a nervous breakdown. I was like, well, you won't have a nervous breakdown by yourself, because I'm not. I gotta, be strong, and it's,
How old was your daughter at the time?
She was 21. She was in college, University of Toledo, and she wanted to drop out of college. And I said I was not going to let cancer rob her of her future. And then you go from sitting in the room, the average is 3 to 5 years. But then you go to 11 years. So we really don't talk about it now, because everybody thinks I'm this strong Black woman. I'm always brave and always strong, but that's not always the case,
Sure.
So it took me a long time to process it. And then you go on the internet and you read, I can remember my best friend, I'm sitting there crying. And she said, well, what's wrong? I said, well, my daughter, I want to see her go to college. And, and she was like, well, how do you know that's not going to happen? She said, quit going on the internet, reading the bad stories, read the good stories of women and men who are living longer with stage 4 breast cancer. And I was like, oh, you got a point. So, we really don't talk about it. I guess I just want them to not think about it and just let me think about it, because I have 3 sisters, and that's why I do what I do, because I don't ever want them to go through what I always tell them I took one for the team, and I did. I don't ever want them to go through this, because this is a beast. So
has your daughter or your sisters done any genetic testing, or are they getting more high risk screenings because of your diagnosis and your mother's diagnosis?
Yes, they did the BRCA and different things like that. But so far, and I pray never that they have to go through this.
I know.
I just pray that it ends with me. Then my dad, he worries, and I have to call him like, okay, I got a good scan, make sure that he's happy. So it's like when you have metastatic breast cancer, sorry.
Yeah, these are tough conversations.
my nosebleeds because my platelets are low. So that's another thing you have to worry about. I guess I just never, it took me a long time to process it, and I think it's still taking my family, even 11 years later, to process it. That's what I have. But
well, and like you're saying, it's living with breast cancer, living with metastatic breast cancer. I don't think the processing ever ends because we're going through it. And, on one of our other podcasts, we were talking a lot about grief, and the woman who was speaking and trying to help us understand what grief is, kind of the light bulb went off when she said, you can grieve while you're processing. It doesn't have to happen afterwards. It's not like the event stops and now you can grieve and then the grieving stops. It's like these circles that go like smaller and wider and smaller and wider, and just kind of like, we don't necessarily know what always is going to trigger us. I remember I'd be driving to work, sunny, beautiful day, and I'd just start bawling, like get to work, mascara is running, I am a wreck, hot flash happening. And I'm like, I can't handle life right now. Like, I just need to take a personal sick day because this is not going well, for no reason, like just out of the blue. And, I think our minds are very powerful and we process things and continue. And Sheila, thank you so much for sharing these. I know these are difficult conversations, but I know that it's helpful for everyone who's listening and watching also to know, like, we resonate with this. It's hard for everybody. And this brings me to my third question, where I want to know how the three of you all got connected and started this fabulous podcast called Our MBC Life. Because we know that our voices are strong. We know we're not going through this alone. We know that whatever we're going through, someone out there is listening and is getting inspiration from us, knowing that they're not suffering in silence. And so I would love to hear how Our MBC Life got started, how you all met each other, and for our listeners to know that there is another podcast out there, in addition to Breast Cancer Conversations, for anyone who is listening who is interested in specifically MBC topics. Check out Our MBC Life.
I guess I'll start, but I have to say that Our MBC Life is a podcast that is a team sport. And I love the language that Sheila uses at times that evokes this, I'm taking one for the whole team. We are a team. So it started where I was diagnosed in 2017, quickly in early 2018, when I sort of had my legs underneath me at that point. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that was fundraising just for metastatic breast cancer research. So I quickly understood that that's something that I needed to focus on, that it was an area that needed attention. And from there, I was introduced through a support group from my treatment research cancer center where I get treated here in New York City. I met a bunch of people, that support group is just a powerhouse of advocates. And so I quickly was schooled by these incredible women. And then from there, I was introduced to Share Cancer Support and because I'm a clinical therapist, at least that's one of my careers that I've had in my life. As a clinical therapist, I thought, you know what, I can utilize some of my skills to lead support groups, and so I did that. I also started leading webinars on issues related to the metastatic breast cancer community for Share Cancer Support. Quickly from there, I felt like those webinars were great and all. But they're one and done. And yeah, they live sometimes on YouTube, but not all the time. And so I felt like these are really important conversations. The metastatic breast cancer community needs those conversations to be more widely available. And so I started talking to the people at Share about different ways to do that, and made the proposal at the end of 2019. That I think a podcast would be a good idea. And I think you and I've talked about this. There's a low barrier to entry to podcasting, but there is a high barrier, at least I would say, to a good podcast. And, so it requires a lot of effort. But again, I made the proposal. They were saying, you know what, we don't think that's a good idea, Lisa. I mean, it was a fine idea, Lisa, but maybe not now. Well, the pandemic hit. And then clearly there was a alignment of how are we going to service the metastatic breast cancer community in an effective way when we can't have in-person conferences and so forth. And then they literally just said, I know we said it didn't sound like a good thing now, but now we think it's a great idea. Mm-hmm. And so quickly on a dime, I was able to just have a small little team of people that thought that this idea was a good one. And from there, we started figuring out how are we going to build this. So for me, the key thing was that everyone on the team should be living with metastatic breast cancer, that it really was for us, by us, and it was for our stories, the way we want to tell them, the priorities that are important to us, and that we would bring in experts and people who are advocating for us who don't necessarily have metastatic breast cancer, certainly, but that our team that works on the podcast we would all be living with this disease. And that was really important to me. In addition, I really wanted it to not be the Lisa Laudico podcast because that would be boring. And I also felt like it needed to be focused on everyone's and the diverse stories out there. And so I wanted a team to join me in this little journey, or whatever we want to call it, this little project. And so from this small team of people, we started figuring out and connecting. And so, of course, as you noted, Sheila McGlown is well known in our community. And so we were really lucky that Sheila decided to join our team. And I have to mention our amazing team member, Shantae Randall. And she with Sheila, I think between Sheila, Shantae, and Victoria Goldberg, who's one of our lead producers, and now she's a host of her own segment on the pod. All three of those incredible women were able to connect us to even more people right within the community, and that's how I got to meet Natalia. Shantae introduced me to Natalia, and so we are all about that. We are open to any listener to this podcast. If you're interested in you're living with metastatic breast cancer, or interested in any aspect of podcasting or in telling stories, writing for our blog, the table is big and wide and huge. And we have I like to think we have a good time doing what we do. One of my things is I really want the podcast to serve our community. I want it to be as well done as we possibly can. And I want it to be fun for the people that are involved in it. So that's a little bit of our origin story.
Wow, what an amazing story, and quite a stellar rock star lineup of people you have on your tribe, on your podcast. And I love the invitation because the table is wide and large. Absolutely. We're very similar in that sense here also on Breast Cancer Conversations, where I know that I can't be an expert in absolutely everything. And that's why it's so great to partner with women like yourselves to come onto the show and talk about what they are experts in and living their own experience, because that is something no one can ever take away from us. And thank you everyone for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast are from personal experiences and are not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you're looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Until next time, keep on thriving.